the Progressive Christian Network of Victoria, which of course is being done via Zoom, as have many of our recent meetings. As we begin, let us acknowledge that wherever we are, we're on the country of one of the First Nations peoples. I am on Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung country, and we honour the elders and ancestors of these people with respect. Let me first say that we are about to have what I think should be a very interesting discussion about the most important piece of research which has been done by West Star Institute and resulted in a book, After Jesus, Before Christianity. We've got a distinguished panel of speakers, which Lord Henry will shortly introduce to us. But before we do that, some of the usual housekeeping things. For your and everybody else's viewing pleasure, please make sure that you keep your mic muted, except when you may be asking a question or invited to ask a question or make a comment. And for the best viewing, you should select speaker view rather than gallery view. The session will be recorded, and in the fullness of time, a properly formatted version of the recording will be put on the PCNV website. Lorna, perhaps I could now pass over to you. Lorna will be mediating the discussion and the presentation by our three presenters. And I'll ask her now to introduce those presenters to you and to lead us into the next part of the meeting. So please go ahead, Lorna.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you very much. And I echo Dick's sentiments that this is a quite exciting meeting because there's a new book, and the title of it, After Jesus, Before Christianity, I think caused all of us to do a double take when we read that. And now we have some very knowledgeable people to take us through it. My task is just to hold the whole thing together and make sure speakers are duly heard, and also to negotiate some questions afterwards. I would encourage you to write your questions if you possibly can in the chat function. And in particular, if as you're listening and you have a question for a particular speaker, that would be really helpful if you address that in your written question. This is a question for, then we can make sure it goes to the right person. And so in case you didn't read the accompanying blurb, here's what we're on about. After Jesus, before Christianity, what happened in the first 2 centuries CE after the death of Jesus? What did groups influenced by Jesus actually do? And what attracted people to them? And one that's sort of simmering away in the background, what implications might this have for us today? So welcome to everyone, and especially to our speakers. I'll just mention them now: David Merritt, Lorraine Parkinson, and John Gunson. But I'll introduce each of these august speakers a bit more fully later on. Here's how the program will work. First of all, David will give a brief introduction to how this book came into being and was put together, that whole idea behind it, and the processes followed. Lorraine will follow then by telling us about the effects of this book on scholarship of the period. John and David both will talk to us about more details about the practices of the day in that time, and their relationship with the Roman Empire, and perhaps how that affects us today. So there will be an opportunity for your questions. Remain alert, perhaps typing as you go. And I'd like to introduce first David Merritt for the introduction to the book. David, as you know well from PCNV, he's been a foundation member, foundation committee member, secretary, over a long time in PCNV. And before he is a retired minister of the Uniting Church of Australia. And before that, he was director of the National Christian Education Agency of the Uniting Church, working with 3 other denominations in New Zealand. So widely experienced. David.
Thank you, Lorna, and for the opportunity to talk about this book. If I can click on the screen and get it to come up, it'll make it easier for you to follow this very brief description of what the book's about. Well, if the screen doesn't come up, I'll act verbally. As Lorna has said, the book is about Jesus before Christianity, and it's an exploration of the first 2 centuries of Jesus' movements. Today's program is designed to introduce you to a report from scholars of the Westar Institute in the book, which was published in November last year, and we think it could change how you think about Christianity. The Westar Institute is best known for the Jesus Seminar, which in the last 2 centuries of the last 2 decades of the last century made a detailed study of every known reference to Jesus in the first 3 centuries, whether they were in religious writings or in secular documents. And it was about what Jesus said and did. And at the end of those 2 decades of work, they published 3 books, the 5 Gospels, the 4 we know about in the New Testament, plus the Gospel of Thomas, which they felt deserved equal prominence, the Acts of Jesus, and the Gospel of Jesus. Afterwards, some years ago, they started a follow-up project to look at what happened after the time of Jesus, and they called it the Christianity Seminar, and it asks what can be known about what happened in the first centuries after the death of Jesus. Obviously, in the Gospels, we have stories about Jesus, but we have very little about what happened in the lives of people. So today we're looking at a report of the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, and particularly about how people lived at that time, influenced by what Jesus stood for and what he taught. One of the initial decisions they had to make when they set out on the Christianity Seminar was, where do you begin such a study? And one of their scholars has said that traditionally there have been 3 choices of where to begin the story of Christianity: the birth of Christ, and he says, please note that name, the resurrection, or Pentecost. And his comment is, these beginnings are, of course, all mythical. That is, there is no record of the event. It is something described or referred to in the later writings after the death of Jesus to promote, to spread, to help people understand the significance of Jesus. The previous main source for knowledge about these early centuries of the church comes from a 4th century bishop, Eusebius of Caesarea. He was a participant in the Council of Nicaea, and he wrote a book called A History of Christianity, from Jesus to Constantine. And he looked back, assuming that the church in which he was a bishop, and all the bishops were male, that church had a beginning that was consistent with where it was at then. So he looked back in those 4 centuries to find events that he felt led to the church as he knew it in the 4th century. And of course, when you know what you're looking for, looking back in history, you select some things that suit your thesis and don't even see other things that are outside your set of assumptions about what was going on. The Christianity seminar instead focused on what people were doing in the name of Jesus, particularly how they lived. And they found very little evidence of the features that we associate with the beliefs and practices of the church. And I quote one of the scholars, "By examining what they were doing, things sort out differently. Church disappears and communities, groups, clubs, and associations appear. Bishops and priests disappear, and a variety of different forms and experiments in social organization appear. Instead of the inevitable triumph of Christianity, we find many forms of resistance to the Roman Empire." At the end of the book, they've described 6 main findings about Jesus groups. And we're going to address these through the sessions today. The 6 main findings are, and I'd hope to have this up on a screen in front of you, but the system isn't working for me. They resisted the Roman Empire. They practiced gender bending, as the scholars describe it. That is, they changed the roles of women and men. Third, they lived in chosen families, not the ones that they were born into or assigned to, but they chose. They claimed belonging to Israel. They had diverse educational structures, and they had persistent oral traditions. Those 6 main features are the main outcomes of the scholars' work, and our presentations today will describe for you some of these findings. Thanks, Lorna.
Thank you, David. Thanks for that overview, the origins and the outline of what we can look forward to in the next 3 examinations. I'm going to ask Lorraine to speak now. Lorraine is someone who is also very well known to us. Welcome, Lorraine, from Brisbane, I understand. Lorraine, I'm not sure whether you're muted or not. If you did say something, then we didn't hear it. But Lorraine is a notable biblical scholar, much appreciated here in Australia, a writer and teacher. She's the author of 2 particular books that we've enjoyed. The first one, Made on Earth, How Gospel Writers Created the Christ, and The World According to Jesus, His Blueprint for the Best Possible World. Lorraine was also a foundation member and committee member of PCNV, long known to us. So thank you for being with us, Lorraine, and we look forward to what you have to offer us about this wonderful book, After Jesus, Before Christianity.
Thank you, Lorna. Yes, it's great to be with you all and see all those familiar faces, I must say, after being up here in Queensland for 9 months now. Now, I have a specific task this afternoon because in about 15 minutes, or maybe a tad more, I'm going to look at ways that after Jesus, before Christianity, may influence the findings and the future work of biblical scholars, in particular of the New Testament. So I'm planning to offer just 2 basic answers to that. To start with, though, I'll just point out that in recent years, many archaeologists have made a huge step in a similar direction to that of the West Star scholars, whereas many of those who work in the Middle East have been called biblical archaeologists. Now they prefer to be known simply as archaeologists. Professor William Deaver, a famous archaeologist, says, "The sooner we abandon the term biblical archaeology, the better." The problem is that many archaeologists have used the Bible as their starting point. They've first of all chosen particular stories in the Bible, and they've then gone out to find archaeological evidence for the historical accuracy of the stories. And of course, conservative churches rely on that kind of archaeology to support a literal historical view of the biblical text. But now the common archaeological method is to just go and look, see what's there. If something interesting is found, well, that's the time to see if its nature and context and dating actually matches the story or situation in the Bible. As they say, very often that's simply not possible. One of their recent controversial conclusions is that there's no archaeological evidence for the biblical story of the Exodus from Egypt. Nothing in Egypt itself, nothing in the Sinai desert or in Israel. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the story has no meaning for its readers. It's simply unlikely to have been an historical event. So many archaeologists are no longer assuming anything, just looking for evidence of past civilizations. And likewise, the basic question that the three West-style scholars had is, what can we understand about the lived experiences of the diverse peoples who associated in different ways with Jesus across the ancient Mediterranean when we start by assuming nothing? As we all know, basic assumptions about any kind of investigation can be very powerful and often quite misleading. One of the biggest of those is pointed out early in the book as the tendency for New Testament scholarship to speak of 1st and 2nd century Christians and Christianity. As the West-style scholars point out, no such entities existed at that time. But for traditional scholars of the New Testament, there's been this natural desire to see the church in their own day as a pristine descendant of the 1st century followers of Jesus. Now, just as a quick aside, there's a contemporary parallel with that kind of assumption. You will all know, I guess, that there's a TV program called Who Do You Think You Are? It concerns people searching for details of their ancestors. So often family stories that are passed on by 2 times great-grandmother or grandfather are simply not historically correct. Details have been fabricated or elaborated or even omitted over time. And of course, that's usually done to preserve the family's reputation. But when professional historians produce documentary evidence about great-great-grandmother, the truth about her life, for good or not so good, emerges. Yes, as my professor of pastoral care, Graham Griffin, was fond of saying to all of us, don't assume anything. In my own studies of this 1st to 2nd century period, I became aware that it was known to non-church scholars as the tunnel or dark period, about which no assumptions ought to be made. In 1996, I commenced my doctoral dissertation on the Jesus of history with these words: New Testament scholarship traditionally tests its hypotheses and presents its findings on the basis of a foundational assumption, namely the existence of a basic continuity between New Testament Jesus traditions and those originating from Jesus himself. And traditional exegetical techniques based on that assumption are still being taught in theological colleges today. And those techniques presuppose answers to questions about the Jesus of history. And it all happens because they're looking through a powerful filter, a Christological doctrinal filter. And through that 4th century filter, New Testament scholars continue to examine 1st and 2nd century texts and the followers of Jesus. That filter also rules out legitimate historical criticism of the writings of the so-called church fathers. As I often say, there are no church mothers, unfortunately. But anyway, in particular, one chap who's mentioned quite a lot in the book, Eusebius of Caesarea. He wrote his ecclesiastical history of the church, as David said, in the 4th century CE. And ever since then, New Testament scholars have assumed that it is historically accurate. But the West Star scholars set aside that traditional assumption and point out the many assumptions that were made by Eusebius himself. For instance, in his naming of 1st century followers of Jesus as Christian. As the West Star scholars say, in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the religion called Christianity was hundreds of years into the future. Christianity was only formally established with its creeds and its doctrine in the 4th century, which happens to be the time of Eusebius himself. But the effect, this is the point, the effect of his ecclesiastical history was to create belief among scholars in the continuation of an essence of Christianity from the 1st century CE onward. According to his writing, essential Christianity, as he put it, began in the 1st century CE and culminated in the 4th century as the state religion of the Roman Empire. Now, another thing, very importantly, Eusebius also declared that Christian leadership succession ran straight from Jesus to the holy apostles to the bishops. So belief in the apostolic succession also relies to a great extent on the 4th century writings of Eusebius. In his book called Peter the Rock, the South Australian scholar Robert Crotty points out gaps in Eusebius's line of succession. Plus, there's the awkward scriptural evidence of various Jesus groups after Jesus' death, all with their own leaders, including one led by his brother James, another by Peter, another by Apollos, and of course another by Paul, just for starters. As the West Star scholars say, who knows how many Jesus groups and leaders there were. So the 4th century church wrote its own story, beginning with an updated book of Acts, and there are signs in the Gospels, as we had them, of 4th century editorializing. That was done in accordance with doctrine being developed at that point. And I guess the clearest example of all of that is Matthew 28, 18 to 20, where Jesus quotes from the 4th century doctrine of the Trinity. Really? Okay. Heresies and heretics were being identified all over the place at that time. And actually, I have some sympathy for Eusebius. He was almost excommunicated for heresy. He did not believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. I kid you not. So what do the authors of After Jesus, Before Christianity now say was the nature of groups of Jesus followers in those first 2 centuries after Jesus? Well, there's detailed description in the book, and we're going to hear more of that from John and David, of the variety of groups, most of which could be called supper clubs. That's meetings around a meal where people were looking for a sense of belonging and identity as Jesus followers. The West Star scholars do acknowledge that these findings are not necessarily new. Various scholars have already written about them. And among those is Hal Taussig, who's one of the 3 authors of After Jesus, Before Christianity. Some of you, I would imagine, have attended Hal Tausig's seminars at St. Michael's on those 1st and 2nd century Jesus-based supper clubs. The important thing for scholarship is that is that the West Star Christianity Seminar and this book have brought many of those scholarly findings about the first 2 centuries together. They now form a much more coherent picture of Jesus' followers in that era. And I think we can all be very grateful for that. But of course, there's so much more, including the question of what kind of language can be used to describe the early followers before Christianity, such as followers of Jesus Anointed, a very Jewish title, very different from believing in Jesus Christ, which of course became the raison d'etre of the 4th century Christian religion. So finally, for scholars far and wide, 2 pieces of crucial advice from the investigations in this book. 1, remove doctrinal spectacles when considering 1st and 2nd century texts. And 2, don't assume anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine, for an exceedingly clear and somewhat waking up kind of address to us about that. I was thinking as you were speaking, my goodness, what sort of filters do we have on all sorts of things that we simply take for granted? So that what you've said to us is very specifically enlightening, but also very widely challenging. Thanks so much. I'm going to now ask John Gunson to speak to us more about the details contained within the book. John, you've been a long-time member of PCNV and you're also a retired minister of the Uniting Church. We seem to have a collection of those. And your book, and well known to many of us, is God, Ethics and the Secular Society. Does the church have a future? Big questions there. Well, you have another set of big questions here. Thank you, John. If you could bring us closer into the book itself.
John, you should first unmute.
Yeah, done that.
Good.
What's happened? I pressed the wrong button. There we are. Right. Thank you, Lorna, for the introduction and the opportunity to share in this panel. I might begin by saying my particular interest in this topic, I think, arises from the fact that before becoming a Uniting Church minister and member, I was a member of the congregational tradition. And when I was a theological student, the aspect of theology that caught my interest most was ecclesiology. I seldom, if ever, hear others in the Uniting Church use that term. We're interested in soteriology, the doctrine of salvation, and all sorts of other ologies. But right from the start of my ministry, it was the doctrine of the church that interested me most. A subject that's virtually taken for granted in most ecclesiastical circles, including the Uniting Church. We know what the church is, we're familiar with it, so we don't even ask that question. We just get on with being the church and doing its work. And in my ministry, the house church movement was at the center of what being the church meant in that situation. So enough said about that, but it draws me very much to this aspect of the research of the West Star Institute. Now, David and I are going to try to give you a bit of detail about this research, and I apologise in advance if I steal any of David's thunder or he's kindly let me go first. We're bound to overlap, and that will reinforce the key information and the key messages that arise from this. So I'm going to talk about what did these early Jesus groups look like in the first 2 centuries. But in thinking about this, it struck me with great force that in order to understand why these groups took the forms that they did, we need first to have in our minds a picture of the world in which these groups took form. Without that larger picture, we will not understand why the groups took the form they did, nor why people joined them. So let me just give a brief picture. I suppose I was brought up on the New Testament, and I think when most of us read the New Testament for the origins and content of Christianity, it's easy to picture Jesus, the itinerant Jewish prophet, teacher, healer, wandering around Palestine, sharing his wisdom and healing ministry among eager crowds, perhaps with little children at his feet and tapping them on the head. Now, while we are aware that this is a Roman-occupied country and that Roman presence is everywhere, it doesn't dominate the New Testament. And it's hardly evident at all as you read the New Testament until the event of the crucifixion itself, which even then is presented as primarily the act of Jesus' own people, the Jews. The research we're looking at today gives an entirely different picture of a whole Mediterranean region, including the land of Israel, under the heel of Rome, of displaced, oppressed, terrorized people, cut off from their roots, their homelands, their families, their communities. And those people were frequently people whose married lives, if they were married, were broken up and separated. The women had been raped by Roman soldiers. The men had been raped often and also dragged off to serve in the Roman army. Families and communities had been split up and dispersed and dragged all over the known world. And this meant that we have a group of people desperately seeking ways to survive, to resist violence and torture and authority, and to find new forms of family, community, identity, belonging, and safety. So within a few decades, and this is the second point that's important, within a few decades of when Paul began his missionary journeys to establish new Jesus groups, the Jewish communities in the land of Israel itself, among which Jesus and Paul lived, these very communities themselves had ceased to exist. In the year 70, and again around 130, as a consequence of Jewish rebellion against Rome, the Jewish state and the Jewish temple had been destroyed, and the Jewish people dispersed around the Mediterranean region, including, of course, those early followers of Jesus and the few groups following the Jesus way. And in this historical context, which, by the way, we need to understand was also a world full of gods, a world full of gods. Everybody had gods. They had temples to them in their own homes, including the Roman gods. It was the Jewish God who had an enormous appeal and advantage over the multiple gods of the nations at that time. You see, the Jewish God, strangely, was not just a national God, but was the creator Lord of the whole universe. And he loved all his creation without exception. You can see, can't you, the enormous appeal of this in the tragic context of those times. And now, scattered throughout the Mediterranean were the followers of this God, no longer just living in Israel, but scattered throughout all the nations of that central world. Not only that, but some of these Jews were called the followers of this Jewish God's anointed one, Jesus. And that's how he was largely known. This Jewish God's anointed one, Jesus, had his own groups of followers. And these Jesus followers had a huge advantage over the other Jews in this dispersed, broken, oppressed, cruel world. They lived out this anointed one's teaching and example in house groups, which expressed the love of this God in love of neighbor, in healing and hospitality, in incorporation into a new family and a new community. Now you can see how this had enormous appeal for people whose national community and family and religious life had been torn asunder by the Romans. And further, the Jewish God's anointed one, Jesus, had faced the worst that the Roman Empire could do in bravely defying Rome and by himself enduring Roman crucifixion. So in what kind of groups did these early followers of Jesus, who I repeat was primarily known as the Anointed One, in what kind of groups did they gather? Well, the majority clearly were house groups, and many of them were modelled on existing trade and association groups of the time. And almost all, without exception, gathered around a shared meal. They had rules of membership, of association, and of behaviour, and not by the way of belief or doctrine. And these rules were voted on by the membership of those groups. I suppose you could say they were congregational groups. They were known by a variety of names. Some were called supper clubs, some were called Jesus clubs, movements for the Saviour, communities of the anointed, the body of the anointed, schools of the Lord, the enslaved of God, brothers and sisters, and perhaps strangest of all to our ears, bathing groups. Why bathing groups as an early form of what we know as the church? Perhaps we should try it. Jesus groups often also practiced communal bathing. If that sounds strange to us, it was a common feature of life in the Roman Empire. The Romans built bathing pools everywhere in their empire, including many in private homes. And so in this way, Jesus groups could socialize and find comfort and refreshment in a common and socially acceptable practice. The New Testament, or at least our version of it, tends to turn this practice into what is called baptism. The Greek word baptizo commonly means bathing or washing. Josephus, the first section first century Jewish historian, talks about washings by John the Bather. We know him as John the Baptist. But bathing was a commonly used symbolic act when joining the community of Israel. And John the Bather's program was intended and was seen as a rejection of Roman bathing practice, and hence Roman rule by bathing in the river. So what happened in these groups of the anointed? Well, as I've said, a shared meal was central. This is a crucial sign and demonstration of hospitality and acceptance. Some took the form of enlarged family groups where, unlike the typical male-dominated family structure of the times, all the members were equal, male, female, and even slaves. And many of these groups were in fact led by women, a totally countercultural act. As Paul says, you're all one in Jesus. There is neither male nor female, slave or free, Jew or Greek. And these groups were not engaged in anything that could be called worship. Neither were there discussions about theology and right belief. Rather, they were about following the teachings and practice of Jesus, the Anointed One. Namely, how best to express life in the kingdom of the Jewish God, as opposed to the Roman Emperor God. That is, how best to live out the teaching of love of neighbour, how to support one another in living safely and creatively in a hostile and divisive and uncaring world. And what support did they have? Very little. Most people at the time probably could neither read nor write. There would have been some few written documents about the life and teaching of Jesus, but not available to everyone and every group. Paul and his letters, according to this research, seem only to be known by the groups that Paul himself started. And Paul, contrary to what we've been brought up to believe, was by no means the key spreader of the early ecclesia groups. So what we have is house gatherings in which all are equal and in which Jesus' way of love of neighbour is paramount. But there was no central leadership, no official dogma, no clergy, no church as we know it today. Indeed, no Christianity. Thank you, Lorna.
Thank you very much, John. It's very challenging to think of the early followers of Jesus finding their feet in such a hostile environment. I think that's what I'm taking over and arching from what you say. It was a hostile environment and they had little support. Thank you very much also for your clear description of that. And now we move to David, and perhaps it's time for me to give a formal introduction again to David Merritt. Hey, David Merritt, the Foundation Committee member, the long-time PCNV. David, for your wisdom and careful reading, I happen to know David, and he is an avid and careful reader. I look forward to this, David.
Well, thank you for that, Lorna. I hope it's not an overstatement of what I can do. John's quite correct in saying that we didn't compare what our contributions were going to be. So some of mine will overlap, but sometimes from a different point of view. Could I first say a little bit about the scholars? I think there were 16 of the Westar scholars involved in the Christianity seminar, plus a lot of quite a number of people who weren't scholars but were able to participate in the discussions. And they did follow a Westar scholar procedure, which has some distinct characteristics. They commissioned papers for discussion by the group. If my memory is correct, they had 69 submissions to the Christianity seminar over the years it was meeting. And their practice was to discuss these very critically and then to take votes from the scholars as to what degree of acceptance the proposition in the paper had. So there are almost none, I think, no ideas in this book that are simply the bright ideas of one scholar. There's been a lot of discussion behind them. Now, let me start by taking a different approach. I'm going to begin by asking you a rather odd question. In the 27 books of the New Testament written in the century after Jesus' death, containing approximately 138,015 words in Greek. I can almost hear some of you beginning a question there, but I don't want to deal with it now. In their 138,015 words, how many times would you think the word Christianos, the Greek word for Christian, has been used? Well, don't guess, because like me, you'd be wrong. The answer is only 3. And this is what the scholars say about this. Christianos is found only 3 times. A comparison with other important words in the New Testament is revealing. Jesus is found 1,002 times. Mary is found 54 times. Israel is found 71 times. Judean or Jew is 14 times. Disciples or students, 241 times. Paul, 169 times. Belief or those who trust, which is the same word in Greek, 65 times. So the point they're making is there are simply only 3 references in the whole of the New Testament using that word Christian, which is an impressive statistic undergirding the basic proposition of this book. Let me now read an example of how a Roman dealt with Christians that he came across. This is an example of how Pliny, a Roman governor in a remote province, sought advice from his emperor Trajan about how to deal with Christians. And as it was written in Latin, the word would be Christus. And here's the letter from Pliny to Trajan. It is my custom to refer all my difficulties to you, sir, for no one is better able to resolve any doubts and to inform my ignorance. I have never been present at an examination of Christians. Consequently, I do not know the nature or the extent of the punishments usually meted out to them. For the moment, this is the line I've taken with all persons brought before me on the charge of being Christian. I have asked them in person if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and a third time with a warning of the punishments awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution. There have been several similarly fanatical ones who are Roman citizens, and I've sent them on the list of persons to be sent to Rome for trial. I considered that I should dismiss any who denied that they were ever or had been Christians when they have repeated after me a formula of invocation to the gods and had made offerings of wine and incense to your statue, which I had ordered to be brought into court for this purpose, along with the image of the gods. And furthermore, that they had reviled the name of Christ. They declared that the sum total of their guilt or error amounted to no more than this. They had met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternatively among themselves in honor of Christ as if to a god, and also to bind themselves to oath, by oath. Their oath was to abstain from theft, robbery, and adultery, to commit no breach of trust, and not to deny a deposit when called upon to repay it. After this ceremony, it had been their custom to disperse and reassemble later to take food of an ordinary, harmless kind. This made me decide it was all the more necessary to extract the truth by torture from 2 slave women. I found nothing but a degenerate sort of cult carried to extravagant length. Well, there you have a Roman official dealing with the mystery of people who were followers of the anointed. The scholars discussed quite a lot about what to call these groups. And they were working on documented evidence of 24 groups. They decided that they would work on descriptions of how people were actually living. They found documentary basis sufficient to include in the book from 24 groups, although they assume there must have been many more. And as John has said, they found a great variety of clubs, families, movements, schools, communities, and groups associated with Jesus the teacher, the anointed, Lord, and Saviour. And interestingly, the scholars present a case that the word student of Jesus is a better translation than disciple of Jesus, as it's an education reference rather than a formal religious reference. As John has said, to understand what's happening to people who are followers of Jesus by whatever name is shaped very much by what we think about is happening in Rome. Rome was an extraordinary empire. It was one of the largest empires in history. It covered a huge area from the north of Britain through Europe and around the Mediterranean Sea into the Middle East. It spanned 3 continents, and it reached its largest expanse in the 1st century. It had an estimated population of 55 to 60 million inhabitants, although some scholars push that up as high as 100 million, up to 1/4 of the world's population then under Roman rule. And this is the point. It reached this size and lasted as long as it did through efficient government, a large and powerful military, and absolutely ruthless practices. And violence was a pervading characteristic of the Romans whenever they occupied a land. If someone who was not a Roman citizen opposed the empire, the penalty was crucifixion. And it was a deliberately public and exceptionally painful, slow death. It advertised what awaited any opponent of the empire. It was said that there were 1,000 crucifixions around the city of Jerusalem when the Romans put it under siege in the war of 65 to 70 after a Jewish rebellion. It was also a Roman practice to take thousands of people from conquered lands to other parts of the empire to work for the empire, as well as reducing the chance that a weakened country could be involved in rebellion. And when the Romans conquered the Judeans in Jerusalem in 70 of the 1st century, They took over 100,000 as slaves to Rome. And it's an interesting side comment to that, that those slaves in the following decade, the year 70 to 80, helped to build the Colosseum, whose ruins still stand in Rome. And much of the cost of that Colosseum was met from the plunder of the treasures and worship artifacts from the great Jewish temple in Jerusalem when the Romans conquered it in 70 of the first century. So you have these people plucked from their land, their families, their friends, and placed as slaves in the center of Roman power, desperate for means of support and ways to survive in this extraordinarily violent environment. And here are several quotes from the book. The life of these Jesus groups came from surviving in the context of the Roman Empire. Their concern was about what to do, how to care for one another. Compared with what they practiced, what they believed was of relatively little concern. And again, their experiments in community life functioned as refuges, as safe places amidst imperial violence. And another quote, while the meaning of the word salvation now lies blanked in belief, its ancient heart meant keeping safe, a means or way of safety. Understood this way, the anointed communities of the first 2 centuries certainly were interested in salvation. They were deeply interested in the communal work of keeping safe. As John has said, one of the ways they survived was creating new families. And for many Judeans who'd heard about Jesus and were moved around the empire, these new families or new clubs gave protection to women. They gave an environment of care to the enslaved, to clothing cleaners, to all sorts of people at the edge of Roman life. And in these families, they explored new relationships between men and women. Now, again, it helps to know a little bit about the rather unusual structure of Roman families and Roman understandings of men and women. In Roman families, men were the head of the family, not our recent kind of nuclear family, but an extended family with several generations of in-laws, but also of workers in the family business, so that if the family business was an orchard, there were free men and slaves who worked in that orchard, they were part of the family. And the Roman family, which was an absolutely basic unit of Roman society, the head of the family was a man. And in Roman society, a man was regarded as a complete person, and a woman was an incomplete man. So Roman society was very clearly structured in the superiority of men and the inferiority of women. And against this background, new groups met not only to eat together, but also to explore different roles. Incidentally, when we read about there being supper clubs, it pays to remember this is a book published in America, and supper is the name for the evening meal, not the snack you have late at night while you're watching the TV. So they're dinner clubs. Against this background, new groups met to eat together, which was a vital need for survival, but also to explore different roles. And you've heard the quote that in Christ there is neither male nor female, bond or free, Jew or Gentile, and it was best not to marry. But these documents seen by the Westar scholars make it clear that that flexibility was worked out in some of these groups of followers of the anointed, and that some of these groups were led by women a radically different sort of society to the Roman one around them. And to quote, they played with gender and sexual boundaries, with some forsaking marriage, and women were prominent leaders, patrons, and participants. In other words, there was nothing that could be called, sorry, I skipped a page there. They identified with the Jewish religious places like synagogues and texts, as had their crucified leader. So to remind you about the 6 main findings, they resisted the Roman Empire. They changed the roles of women and men. They lived in chosen families. They claimed belonging to Israel. They had diverse educational structures. They had persistent oral traditions. And as the book states in several places, in the first 2 centuries, Christianity did not exist. The scholars who examined research about these varied groups of Jesus people did not find evidence of any wider organization of the groups, system to appoint or approve leaders, or only male leaders, of entry and requirements other than the rules of the group. There were no required beliefs or guides to worship practices. In other words, there was nothing that could be called Christianity. There were many different groups, clubs, chosen families, people supporting each other, resisting the terrible threats of the powerful Roman Empire, eating meals together, sharing food with each other, and with other desperate people from the society who were in danger and were hungry. They treasured memories of their crucified teacher. They discussed what it could mean to live in his new empire under the oppression of the Roman Empire. We tend to know that Jesus' teaching focused a lot on the kingdom of God, but the word kingdom is widely regarded as not the appropriate translation. It came about because the King James Version, when King James of England commissioned an authorized version, and the scholars came across the word for gathering, ecclesia, they translated that as church, and translated empire, the word that's basileia, which could be kingdom or empire, as appropriately kingdom. They were working for a king. But if you think about the setting in which there were very few kingdoms in that vast Roman Empire, the power ruling group was the emperor. So what Jesus was teaching was, what would life be like within the empire of God rather than the empire of Rome? They had bits of news of other groups. There were very few written documents. Those of you who are familiar with the letters of Paul know that Paul could neither read nor write. He was dependent on slaves. If you're not sure about that, have a look at the last 5 or 6 verses of many of his epistles, where he says, "See how I greet you with my large hands." In other words, a man who couldn't write would put a word in to show he was communicating with them, but the writing and often the reading came from educated people who were taken as slaves from other places. What they discussed in these groups was, what would it mean to live in the new empire of their crucified Lord, anointed one, under the oppression of the Roman system. They kept their links with their Jewish heritage, but above all, while they were oppressed by the powerful powerful empire ruling every day, they explored how to live as part of a new empire that Jesus had described. I think that is an extraordinarily impressive and challenging way to understand those centuries. Now, what I've described so far, I think, is faithful to what's in this remarkable book. I found it stimulating, though a bit dull and heavy going in parts. But I've chosen to risk making a final comment on my own thinking after reading the book, and to say that what I'm about to say is not what the scholars wrote. It's only a few weeks ago that we received from the Australian Bureau of Statistics the first figures from the 2021 census. Among other things, they show that Christianity is in serious decline in Australia. Over 1 million fewer people classified affiliation with Christianity than in the 2016 census 5 years before. And the largest numerical declines were for Anglican, Catholic, and Uniting Church denominations. I think it's true to say there are few from generations under 60 years of age in our churches. I think the census shows again that our traditional ways of expressing a Christian way are seriously out of touch with most Australians. To read of these students of the teacher Jesus finding ways of living a new way under tough conditions, I found at times breathtaking and often posing questions for me. Somewhere recently I read that history is the decisions made by people within the circumstances of their time. What the people described in this book did cannot be a guide for us because our life situations are so different. But that they worked out how to live lives enriched by the example and teachings of their executed leader under their living conditions stays with me to disturb and encourage me. We know what lies ahead for these groups in just 2 more centuries. And I should say that the scholars of the Christianity Seminar are well into examining the 3rd and 4th centuries along the same lines that they have reported in this book on the first 2 centuries. We know that over the next 200 years from the time this book describes, the movement was organized. It was taken over by men who suppressed leadership by women. It introduced rules for being Christian and requirements for church membership, including a long list of required beliefs called creeds. And that the next report of the Christianity Seminar on those 2 centuries, I think, will be fascinating to say the least. But for now, we have this sketchy pen picture of how it all started in those first 2 centuries after the execution of Jesus by the Romans, and before Christianity and the church were organized. Isn't that an extraordinarily stimulating thing to be facing at this point in our history in Australia? And I hope that it will make some of us think about what would enrich our living in our time. And the presentation team hopes that at least some of that has been interesting to you. Thank you, Lorna.